As somehow I reached thinking about that night, I thought the hardest part was to understand saw that night as something that belonged and started feeling like something heavy, or even to me alone. It wasn't just memory that would make the silence feel like it became shared absence. And I started feeling like something larger. The silence something that feel like something for years without I started breaking it into smaller fragments. It felt like something that was still reflected as if I could isolate the exact without I realized that we had both at first in the same life through conflicting treatment like a normal adjustment. Without ever realizing that this was just what life looked like after a long marriage and the marriage long where everything ever said the words out loud. No argument that much I understood now. People move forward. No sentence that crossed the line. But what I didn't expect was how often my mind was that I had also thought I had already understood. Just in a different way. Instead, not the divorce, not physically, but the conversation ways that never felt from the outside. The way she spoke. But emotional, the way she paused, fully I had already stepped out of the space like she was interrupting I ever realized there was something I needed to stay present without realizing I was already I kept thinking about how natural everything part was that I none of them mattered individually, how normal the routines were, but together, small details how stable the structure of our life things I was sure I understood started to feel that realization was instability and the more I tried to reconstruct that night in my mind, I had believed that as long as we were still functioning as a household, specific. That I had never paid attention to been a clear mistake. Still going something to realize daily life together. Something I could identify. I wasn't just thinking about being lost. I was trying to understand that what I called instability might have been something else entirely. Because there was what I was left those instead because presence is not just and I had only noticed it after silence stretched across the absence of words. Started to bother me more than routine is not the same thing as connection. Because if I had misunderstood something so fundamental, single moment might have tried to reach me in ways I meant I might have because there was never more than I wanted to not dramatic attempts. Not instead, just the end of there were two separate processes but the entire way all happening while I was still inside. One of them was her signals that required attention when I started to go back in that night again and again. And what made it worse was not because I wanted most the other was me slowly convincing myself I remembered them as normal something I had clearly missed. Because nothing had collapsed something that didn't feel routine interactions and didn't stand out but now felt like it might have changed everything. But now those same moments felt those two processes never aligned. The more I started to feel that was the conversation because I had changed the way I was looking at not anger. It was just the memories that once felt aware that something had already but the realization that we had long failed to understand that simple decisive always something in the weeks after the divorce. We had simply stopped arriving sometimes it only becomes visible when someone else is no longer there. I got it already reached the ending I kept returning to the idea I made coffee the same way I always did when there was no longer anyone there to share the arrival. I tried to understand it as emotional television everything went to bed. Something vague and gradual. From the outside, every conversation now looked like I was handling everything reasonably well. It wasn't just about assuming no dramatic breakdowns. It was about every time I had released it not there was enough where she was. No visible signs asking whether I was actually found something else instead of present. None of it was stood out on its own. Rejection energy obvious that was the most unsettling part. Something quieter. It was only in something easier to miss. The strange thing about silence is that by then realized there was nothing left in the presence. Nothing had ever felt broken. Even when what remained was the strange sense of another life. My life living the entire shared life. A door opening somewhere. I was still not experiencing it at the same speed. Footsteps in another room. I wasn't aware of losing any the sound of someone making while still standing. I was just moving through days the way people remained fully convinced that nothing believing that as long as nothing dramatic until the moment everything was still undeniable. They feel and by the time that truth becomes almost not the same thing. It no longer belongs and that difference started to change the way I looked at everything. It simply becomes something you have to live with. The house wasn't empty and the marriage didn't collapse in one moment. Everything was still there. It didn't fail because of a single decision or a single night. The photographs were still hanging on the walls. The dishes were still in the cabinet. Never felt significant enough even to remember properly. Felt strangely organized in the silence that wasn't loud enough to be noticed fully accepted that she was no longer part of it. In the assumptions I made about what moments when I would walk into a room and expect to see her without whether she experienced it the same way. The expectation and once I understood that, and the reality would arrive a second later. Because it meant there was no place to put the blame myself that work would solve the problem. No point in time where I could say, this is where it broke. Whenever life became complicated, there was only I buried myself in projects, schedules, deadlines, and responsibilities. It was familiar territory. Predictable. Measurable. If something went wrong at work, there was usually a solution. If there wasn't a solution, there was at least a next step. But this was different. No amount of effort seemed capable of producing an answer. I started staying later at the office, even when I didn't need to. Sometimes I would sit at my desk after everyone else had gone home and stare at plans or reports without actually reading them. I told myself I was concentrating. In reality, I was just delaying the moment when I would have to return to an empty house. The drive home became the worst part of the day. At work, there were conversations, phones ringing, people needing things. There was enough activity to keep my thoughts occupied. But inside the car, there was nowhere for my mind to go except back into itself. Some nights I drove with the radio on just to fill the space. Other nights I drove in complete silence and found myself replaying old conversations I hadn't thought about in years. At first, I wasn't trying to analyze the marriage. I was simply remembering. Or at least that's what I told myself. I would think about vacations we had taken, dinners with friends, holidays, ordinary weekends. But over time, those memories started changing. Not the events themselves, but the way I looked at them. Situations that once seemed perfectly normal began to feel different when viewed through the lens of everything that had happened. I remembered moments when Laura seemed quieter than usual. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Everyone has bad days. Everyone gets tired. But now I found myself wondering what had been happening inside her during those moments. Had she been disappointed? Lonely? Trying to tell me something without knowing how? Or was I simply rewriting the past because I was desperate for an explanation? That question followed me everywhere. The more I searched my memories, the less confident I became in them. I had always assumed that two people living through the same experiences carried roughly the same version of those experiences forward. Now I wasn't so sure. Laura had described our marriage in a way that felt both familiar and completely foreign. The events she talked about had happened. I remembered them. But somehow they seemed to mean something entirely different to her. I started noticing how often my thoughts returned to that realization. We had lived in the same house. Shared the same meals. Attended the same family gatherings. Slept in the same bed. Yet somehow, we had been experiencing two very different realities. The more I thought about that, the harder it became to let it go. There were nights when I sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight, trying to pinpoint where our versions of the story had begun to separate. I wasn't looking for someone to blame anymore. At least I don't think I was. What I wanted was understanding. I wanted to find the moment where the life I believed I was living stopped matching the life she felt she was living beside me. But every time I thought I was getting closer to an answer, another memory would surface and complicate everything again. And slowly, without fully realizing it, I stopped focusing on the divorce itself. The divorce was no longer the mystery. The mystery was everything that had happened before it. The mystery was how two people could spend more than 2 decades together and walk away with such different versions of the same marriage. That question stayed with me long after the paperwork was signed. It followed me through my days. Through my evenings. Through the quiet hours when there was nothing left to distract me. And eventually, It led me back to the one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. That night. The night Laura said had changed everything. The night I remembered very differently than she did. The more I thought about that night, the less certain I became that I actually remembered it. At first, I believed I did. I could picture coming home late. I could remember being exhausted. I could remember talking about work. I could remember seeing Laura in the kitchen. Those facts felt solid. If someone had asked me to describe the evening before the divorce conversation ever happened, I would have said there was nothing unusual about it. It was just another long day during a stressful period of my life. But after she described that night from her perspective, I found myself returning to it over and over again. And each time I did, something new started to emerge from the background. The problem was that memory doesn't work the way we like to think it does. We imagine our memories as recordings, stored somewhere inside us exactly as events happened. But the more I examined my own, the more I realized they were closer to summaries. My mind had preserved what seemed important to me at the time, and quietly discarded everything else. For years, I had treated that night as insignificant, which meant that most of what happened had never been carefully stored in the first place. I started replaying it during the drive to work. Then during lunch. Then while lying awake at night. I wasn't trying to torture myself. At least that's what I told myself. I was trying to understand. Trying to find the point where her version and my version separated from each other. But every time I revisited the memory, I found myself noticing details that hadn't seemed meaningful before. I remembered arriving home and seeing a light on in the kitchen. I remembered thinking it was unusual because it was later than normal. At the time, I hadn't attached any significance to that observation. Now I wondered why she had stayed awake. Was she waiting for me? Had she been standing there for hours trying to find the right words? Had she already rehearsed the conversation she wanted to have? Before I even pulled into the driveway. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable those questions became. I remembered setting my keys down on the counter. I remembered loosening my tie. I remembered talking almost immediately about a problem at work that had consumed my entire day. I could even remember specific pieces of the conversation I thought I was having. What I couldn't remember was what Laura was doing while I talked. That realization hit me harder than I expected. How could I remember my own words so clearly, but not remember her reaction? I tried to force the memory into focus. I closed my eyes and reconstructed the room. The kitchen. The overhead light. The counter. The chairs. Little by little, fragments began to return. Not complete memories. Just impressions. A look on her face. The way she leaned against the counter. The fact that she seemed unusually quiet. Years earlier, none of those details would have mattered to me. Now they felt like pieces of evidence. I began questioning other memories too. Not just that night. Entire periods of our marriage. Once doubt enters your recollection of one event, it has a way of spreading into everything around it. I started wondering how many conversations I had misunderstood. How many moments I had interpreted through my own assumptions, without ever considering how she experienced them. One evening, I found myself looking through old photographs. I hadn't planned to. I was searching for something else in a closet and came across a box filled with pictures from different years of our marriage. Vacations. family gatherings, holidays, birthdays. At first, I thought the photographs would comfort me. Instead, they left me feeling unsettled. I found myself studying Laura's face in each image. Not looking at where we were or what we were doing. Looking at her. Trying to determine whether she looked happy. Trying to find signs that would confirm or disprove the story she had told me. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on me. I was sitting alone in a quiet house, analyzing photographs like a detective investigating a crime that had happened years earlier. Yet I couldn't stop. Every image felt like a clue. Every smile raised new questions. Was it genuine? Forced? Was she already unhappy then? Had she already started pulling away emotionally? Or was I projecting the ending backward into moments that had once been perfectly normal? The truth was that I didn't know. And that uncertainty started to consume me. For most of my life, I had trusted my perception of reality. If I remembered something happening a certain way, I assumed that was more or less what happened. But now I was facing the possibility that two people could live through the exact same event and carry away completely different truths from it. Laura hadn't accused me of lying. That was what made it so difficult to dismiss her perspective. She genuinely believed what she had told me. In her mind, that night represented a turning point. A moment when she reached for me and realized I wasn't really there. Yet from my perspective, it had been an ordinary evening that barely deserved a place in my memory. Both versions couldn't be identical. Yet both felt real. That realization disturbed me more than anything she had said during the divorce conversation. Because if her memory and my memory were both honest, then the problem wasn't that one of us was wrong. The problem was that we had been living inside entirely different emotional realities, without recognizing it. The more I thought about that possibility, the more examples started appearing. Moments I had interpreted as routine might have felt significant to her. Things I dismissed as temporary frustrations might have lingered in her mind for years. Situations I barely remembered at all might have become defining memories in the story she told herself about our marriage. And for the first time, I started wondering whether the night she described wasn't important because of what happened. Maybe it was important because of what didn't happen. Maybe the memory stayed with her because she waited for something from me that never arrived. That thought followed me everywhere. It followed me into meetings. It followed me through grocery stores. It followed me home at night. No matter what I was doing, the more I tried to understand that night, the more I began to realize that I had been looking at it in completely the wrong way from the very beginning. I kept treating it like a single moment. Something that either mattered or didn't matter depending on how you interpreted it. But what I started to see instead was that it wasn't a single moment at all. It was a sequence of small moments. And I had only ever paid attention to the ones that were convenient for me to remember. I started going back to it again. Not just in memory, but in the way you examine something you assume you already understand. I stopped focusing on what I said. I stopped focusing on what I was thinking. I stopped focusing on the obvious parts of the evening that I had always considered the main structure of that memory. Instead, I began to look for what I had ignored. The parts that didn't feel important at the time, but now felt like they might have been the actual meaning of everything that happened. And that was when something shifted in the way I understood her words. She had said that she felt alone in our marriage. She had said that she had been trying for years. She had said that she had already been preparing to leave long before that conversation ever happened. At the time, I had understood those things as general statements. Emotional summaries of a long period of distance between us. But now I started to realize she wasn't talking in general terms at all. She was pointing to something specific. Something that had happened that night. Not in the way I had experienced it, but in the way she had experienced me. That night wasn't just another evening where I came home late and talked about work without noticing much else around me. That was how I remembered it. But for her, that night had already started long before I walked through the door. She had been waiting for me with something she had been holding inside for a long time. Not anger. Not frustration in the ordinary sense. Something more fragile than that. Something she had built up the courage to finally say out loud. And the moment I entered the house, I interrupted it without even realizing it. I remember now that she wasn't just quiet that night. She was different in a way I didn't know how to recognize at the time. There was a kind of stillness in her that wasn't normal for her. Not the kind of silence that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from holding something in place that is about to break if it isn't released soon. She had been preparing to speak to me. I can see that now. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the way people prepare sentences they have rehearsed too many times in their head. Because they are afraid they won't be heard if they don't say them perfectly. She had chosen that night for a reason. Not because it was special, but because she couldn't wait any longer. And then I came in. And filled the space without noticing that there was already something waiting to be said inside it. I can remember now how quickly I started talking. How I moved from the doorway into the rhythm of my own thoughts without pausing long enough to notice hers. I remember how natural it felt to shift into work mode. To explain problems. To describe pressure. To continue the version of myself that existed outside the marriage. Without realizing I had just stepped into a moment where the marriage itself needed something from me. And she tried. That is the part one had missed completely before. She didn't just remain silent. She attempted to enter the conversation. Not loudly. Not in a way that interrupted me. She tried in the only way she thought would still reach me. A pause. A name. A small opening of a sentence that never fully formed. Because it collided with my momentum before it had a chance to exist properly. But I didn't slow down. I didn't recognize it as an attempt. I didn't even register it as something that required a response. And that was the point where everything changed. Even though nothing on the surface looked different. Because what I understand now is that she wasn't just trying to talk to me that night. She was testing whether there was still a version of me that could hear her at all. And when she realized there wasn't, she didn't argue. She didn't push harder. She stopped trying in that exact way. Because something inside her reached a conclusion I had never been present for. That night was not the beginning of her decision to leave. It was the moment she stopped believing that I would ever arrive in the part of our life where she was already waiting. And I had walked through it. Without ever realizing I had been given one last chance to notice her. At some point, thinking about that night stopped feeling like an attempt to understand the past. And started feeling like something heavier. It wasn't just memory anymore. It became comparison. I would go through it again and again. But not as a single scene. I started breaking it into smaller fragments. As if I could isolate the exact point where things went wrong if I looked closely enough. But the more I did that, The more I realized there wasn't a single point to find. There was no clear moment where everything changed. No argument that escalated too far. No sentence that crossed a line. No decision that could be marked as the beginning of the end. Instead, there were only smaller things. Ordinary things that never felt important on their own. A conversation I didn't fully engage in. A moment I interrupted without realizing it. A pause I didn't notice because I was already thinking about something else. None of them mattered individually. But together, they started forming something I couldn't ignore anymore. That realization was uncomfortable in a way I didn't know how to process at first. It would have been easier if I could point to something specific. If there had been a clear mistake. Something obvious. Something I could identify and separate from everything else. Then I could have made sense of it. I could have contained it. But what I was left with instead was something that couldn't be contained. A pattern that stretched across years. Without ever announcing itself as a problem while it was happening. I started thinking about how many times she might have tried to reach me in ways I didn't recognize at the time. Not dramatic attempts. Not confrontations. Just small openings. Small signals that required attention I wasn't always giving. And what made it worse was that I didn't remember most of them as failures. I remembered them as normal days. Ordinary evenings. Routine interactions that didn't stand out in any way at all. But now those same moments felt different. Not because they had changed. But because I had changed the way I was looking at them. The same memories that once felt harmless now carried a different weight. I began to understand that absence isn't always something you notice while it's happening. Sometimes it only becomes visible when someone else is no longer there to fill it. I kept returning to the idea that she had said she felt alone in our marriage. At the time, I had tried to understand it as emotional distance. Something vague and gradual. But now it felt more concrete. It wasn't just about feeling disconnected. It was about repeated experiences of not being met where she was. Moments where she reached out and found something else instead of presence. Not rejection in an obvious sense. Something quieter. Something easier to miss. The hardest part was realizing that from my perspective, nothing had ever felt broken while it was happening. I wasn't walking through my life thinking something was wrong. I wasn't aware of creating distance. I wasn't aware of losing anything in real time. I was just moving through days the way people usually do. Believing that as long as nothing dramatic was happening, everything was still intact. But now I understood that intact and connected are not the same thing. And that difference started to change the way I looked at everything that had come before. I began to see that the marriage didn't collapse in one moment. It didn't fail because of a single decision or a single night. It failed in the space between moments. In the parts of life that never felt significant enough to remember properly. In the silence that wasn't loud enough to be noticed as silence. In the assumptions I made about what stability meant. Without ever checking whether she experienced it the same way. And once I understood that, I couldn't unsee it anymore. Because it meant there was no place to put the blame in a clean, simple way. No point in time where I could say, this is where it broke. Instead, there was only accumulation. By the time I reached that point in my thoughts, I no longer saw that night as something that belonged to her alone. Or even to me alone. It had stopped being a single event in our shared history. And started feeling like something larger. Something that had been forming for years without either of us fully naming it. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized that we had both been interpreting the same life through completely different timelines, without ever once stopping to compare them in real time. She had left the marriage long before she ever said the words out loud. That much I understood now. But what I hadn't understood until this point was that I had also left. Just in a different way. Not physically. Not in any way that could be seen from the outside. But emotionally. I had already stepped out of the space between us long before I ever realized there was something I needed to stay present for. I kept thinking about how natural everything had felt at the time. How normal the routines were. How stable the structure of our life appeared from my perspective. I had believed that stability meant nothing was falling apart. I had believed that as long as we were still functioning as a household, still sharing space, still going through the motions of daily life together, then nothing essential was being lost. But now I understood that what I called stability might have been something else entirely from her side. Because presence is not just physical. And silence is not just the absence of words. And routine is not the same thing as connection. I began to see that there was no single moment where we drifted apart. Because there was never a clean break to point to. Instead, there were two separate processes unfolding at the same time. One of them was her slowly reaching the conclusion that she was alone in a relationship that still technically existed. The other was me slowly convincing myself that everything was still working. Because nothing had collapsed in an obvious way. And somehow, without either of us realizing it, those two processes never aligned. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not anger. Not regret in the dramatic sense. But the realization that we had not failed each other in a single decisive moment. We had simply stopped arriving in the same emotional place at the same time. She had already reached the ending long before she spoke it. And I only reached it when there was no longer anyone there to share the arrival with. It made me rethink everything that came before that night. Every conversation I had dismissed as ordinary. Every moment I had assumed was insignificant. Every time I had believed that being there was enough. Without asking whether I was actually being felt there. None of it stood out on its own. That was the most unsettling part. It was only in retrospect that the pattern became visible. And by then, there was nothing left in the present that could change it. What remained was the strange recognition that two people can live an entire shared life. And still not experience it at the same speed. One person can begin to leave quietly while still standing in the room. The other can remain fully convinced that nothing has changed. Until the moment the absence becomes undeniable. And by the time that truth becomes clear, it no longer belongs to the past or the present. It simply becomes something you have to live with. After everything, I expected to feel something clearer. Anger, maybe. Or regret that finally made sense of it all. But it never came in the way I thought it would. There was no sudden moment of clarity that fixed everything. Or gave it meaning. Just a quiet understanding that settled in slowly. Without asking for permission. I stopped trying to rebuild the night in my mind. I stopped searching for the exact moment where things had gone wrong. Because I finally understood there wasn't one. Nothing dramatic to point at. Nothing simple enough to explain it away. Just years of small distances. That no one corrected in time. And what stayed with me most wasn't what she said in the end. Or even how she left. It was the realization that she had already been gone long before I understood what "gone" meant. I used to think I lost her the day she asked for a divorce. But now I understand. That was only the day I finally noticed what had already happened. And by the time I noticed, there was nothing left to change.